Want to use a PGR in your cereals but have no time for a separate pass? Manipulator PGR can be applied as early as one tiller. Just add it to your herbicide to reduce lodging, increase harvest efficiency, and maximize yields. Talk to your retailer for more info and to confirm acceptable tank mixes.
I am your host, Lindsay Smith, and if you've been following along about the, of course, troubling, but perhaps not entirely surprising infection of highly pathogenic avian influenza in cattle, you'll know that on this show, I talked about the fact that the bovine practitioners of America were trying to get industry and government to start calling it bovine influenza A virus. I wanted to know, what does the Canadian Food Inspection Agency think? And well, not just about that, but about several other things. And so now we are going to hear from the CFIA and where we're at on this disease, what we're calling it, and if we may see a change in animal movement restrictions or what farmers could be doing to protect their dairy and cattle herds from HPAI. Joining me now on the line is Dr. Martin Appelt. He's the Senior Director of the Animal Health Programming for CFIA. Welcome here, Dr. Appelt.
Hello, Lindsay. Thanks for having me.
All right. So we are going to talk about either HPAI in cattle or bovine influenza A virus. It's the same thing. Which name is CFIA using?
I think we stick with highly pathogenic avian influenza in cattle for the time being.
For the time being. Okay. Now, and why is that? What is the distinction of whether or not we want to call it something else, or are we're firm on what it is right now? What's the decision there?
So nomenclature for pathogens is always a touchy subject and subject to international conventions and norms. And it's not easy to introduce new ones or change existing ones. So what we know is that what we're dealing with is a variant of the virus that is present currently in wild bird populations, and that's why we stick with the high path avian influenza nomenclature for now. But happy to adapt when the international community changes its mind on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and this is, I think, one of those things that certainly we're learning about is, certainly the pathogen itself needs a name, and then, as you said, there has to be sort of consensus on what you're going to call it. So we'll stick with HPAI in cattle for now. So as of now, as of recording, do we have positive cases in Canada beyond poultry or avian species at this time?
We do have one case of a domestic dog from last year.
Right.
But specifically with regards to any livestock or humans, no, we do not at the time of this recording. Okay.
Now, that of course may change. So what is CFIA? What is the surveillance right now? What does surveillance look like right now for HPAI in cattle?
Before I jump right into answering your questions, let me just say that the fact that an influenza virus infects different species is neither unexpected nor highly unusual. In fact, we need to realize that most of the influenza viruses that plague humans, and Canadians certainly have plenty of experience with influenza and flu in the course of our winters, come from the animal kingdom originally and have specialized and made humans their host. So what we are seeing now that a virus that is predominantly infecting poultry occasionally develops the ability to cause illness in other species of mammals is not entirely unusual or unexpected. The good thing here is we are all watching the situation in the United States very, very diligently, and communication with our U.S. counterparts is great in the sense that we are learning a lot about what their findings are, and that informs what we're doing here in Canada. In Canada, our disease surveillance network that is supported by our industry, by the provinces and the federal government through a series of laboratories and well-known pathways, how samples are taken and submitted by private veterinarians when there is any suspicion that it might be a disease of interest. That really helps us in being prepared for an event such as the one we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. So excellent point there, and I'm glad you brought it up. Obviously, we've had these positive cases in the U.S. The U.S. is working diligently, of course, to learn as much as they can about HPAI happening in cattle. And so your CFIA and Canadian counterparts, obviously in communication with them. As of this point, has what we've learned from the U.S. changed the strategy at all for CFIA as far as surveillance or positive reports or what will happen when and if we have a case in cattle?
The connections between Canada and the U.S. on a trade level are quite tight. So certainly, yes, we have been preparing for the possibility that we detect an HPAI case in dairy cattle or in cattle here in Canada. And we made sure that, first of all, our laboratories are prepared. Second of all, private veterinarians in practice are aware that this is something they need to think of when they look at cattle, especially dairy cattle, with certain signs, and that it is a possibility to test for it.
From the biosecurity aspect, because that, of course, becomes something that farmers can take some action on, obviously, is having a good biosecurity plan. Do we know for sure the key components of that biosecurity plan? Specifically, there's been some discussion, does pasteurization of milk kill this virus? Is that 100%? Do we know that?
So let's start with your last concern with regards to human safety here. You may recall there's one case in the United States where a human infection, a very mild infection, has been attributed to infected cattle, although it is not entirely certain how tight those links really are. It may have been an infection with avian influenza virus that came directly from, for example, bird droppings or something similar. But it is not impossible. And we've seen cases elsewhere in the world that humans get infected or can become infected with avian influenza. So the question in the case of dairy cattle, when the virus was detected in milk from those cattle, is what does it mean for humans? Mm-hmm. So avian influenza by far is not the only pathogen that can be shed in milk when a dairy animal is infected with a disease. There's many others, from brucellosis to tuberculosis and others. Pasteurization, that's why we have it. It has been a lifesaver over generations. And pasteurization done right has proven to be highly effective in eliminating or greatly reducing most of the pathogens commonly found in milk. And that includes influenza viruses. So all we can tell at this point is pasteurized milk remains safe for that reason.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, final question then. Certainly one of the things we've seen in the U.S., as we're trying to sort of get a handle on how this disease spreading animal to animal, and how it moves, we did see some states, of course, that restricted cattle movement between them. We've certainly seen that on the poultry side of restricted movement. What would a plan look like, or is restriction of animal movement on the table should a positive case happen here in Canada for either cattle or hogs?
Let me start by saying that highly pathogenic avian influenza in Canada is a notifiable disease by law. So any occurrence of that disease, when it is found, has to be reported to CFIA. This does not mean that CFIA will automatically react to the disease the same way, regardless of which species it is found in. We know how the disease reacts in poultry, especially when it gets into commercial poultry with a relatively rapid spread, difficult to contain, big commercial impact. Therefore, there is a need to quarantine the farms, have control zones, humanely dispose of the birds, and it has a large impact on the farming communities and the farmers, and of course on commerce as a whole. At this point, with what we know, we do not anticipate that similar measures would have to be taken in dairy cattle. It is always prudent in the interest of biosecurity to have good protocols, to be really careful when bringing outside animals into the herd, make sure there is a quarantine protocol, segregate them when they're sick, and so on. But at this point, there are no movement restrictions in place. Having said that, I want to be very clear. We are still learning. It's a dynamic environment, and that may change. It may become necessary, especially depending on the situation. If you imagine where you have poultry in close proximity to a dairy operation, to say, the best course of action would be to try and contain it as much as possible and not move anything into and out of that farm. So I'm not ruling it out for the future. With what we know right now, there are no movement restrictions in place.
Okay, and an excellent point about proximity to poultry, in that we've certainly seen this disease this pathogen in cattle does not have nearly the morbidity or mortality rates that it does in birds, but that doesn't mean that it can't cause that in birds should they be exposed through cattle. So really good point there that we have to think about other farms around a farm, for sure. All right. I believe that is all the questions that I have, Dr. Appelt. I really appreciate your time in digging into these, and certainly we can cross our fingers that this won't ever be a Canadian case, but given the migration, that certainly is probably not realistic. I guess that's where I'll leave it finally and give you the last word. As we reach peak migration timing, what are sort of the main things that producers should be doing to potentially limit access by cattle to those feces from those birds flying overhead?
So directly separating dairy cattle and birds is really, really difficult, given the fact that most dairy operations are indoor-outdoor operations, which means the cows have access to the outdoors, birds have access to the indoors. So it is very difficult to keep them completely separate. In the ideal world, that would be the case, and certainly from a biosecurity standpoint, as much as can be done in an operation reasonably to minimize the contact of dairy cattle feed, especially with wild birds and wild bird droppings. Those are all helpful measures. And as I already mentioned, being very diligent with movements into and out of the farm. So in case there is a disease transfer, we can be reasonably certain it stays localized and does not spread in an undetected manner to many other farms. And unfortunately, that was one of the situations in the United States where spread of the disease happened because of animal movement to quite a considerable extent.
All right. We will definitely be keeping tabs on this. Dr. Appelt, I thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.